Hello, in this video I'm going to be answering some questions about the shed build that I completed for my brother a few months ago now. And as this is now the third shed that I've built over the years, from scratch, from the ground up, I've learned a lot, I've made a lot of mistakes, so I want to share that knowledge with you. Also, if you didn't see my follow-up video about a couple of problems that we had with shrinkage in the tongue and groove cladding, despite us fitting it as tightly as we possibly could because the wood was so wet when it arrived, there was an area that I managed to fix in that video and another area that I failed to fix, and hopefully I'll get around to sorting that out in this video too. Thanks to Fiverr for sponsoring this video. First though, I am just going to have a look around and see how things are holding up. My brother kept an eye on the cladding, by the way, and during that spell of hot weather, no more gaps opened up, which is good. And since then we've had a period of quite wet weather, so the wood has swollen again. In fact, even that gap area that I hadn't fixed has now closed itself up. But anyway, it still needs sorting today. Down the back of the shed, my brother was meant to install the guttering, but looks like he hasn't got round to that yet. And that means all of the water is running down this back wall, and then it's hitting the ground and splashing back onto the bottom pieces of cladding too. And as we've learned over the years, soil that's in contact with timber is bad news, because all of the bugs and microbes living in that soil will eat away at the timber. So I need to prompt my brother to get on with this before the winter comes. I had a quick look at the roof and everything looked great. And then I had a quick look inside. Everything else is looking well. Right, so on to some questions, and one of the most frequently asked questions was, why did we use uPVC windows and doors? First, they're basically maintenance free. It's common for wooden shed doors to drop over time, and that can happen no matter what method of joinery you use, and no matter how well you brace them. As a side note, I still think the method of housing the diagonal braces into the horizontal rails, as I did on a large set of driveway gates a few years back, is probably the best method. But anyway, what tends to happen is once the wood has had a few years of expanding and contracting and weathering, and everything kind of settles, it's common to find that the door bolt and hardware no longer aligns properly, meaning you either need to find a way to kind of force the door back into its original shape, or adjust the hinges or hardware, which can be a pain. With these, you don't need to worry about any of that stuff, as adjustments are easy to make, so basically you can just set and forget. You also don't need to worry about a uPVC door warping, rotting, cracking, or gaps opening up. Secondly, they're cheap. Well, second-hand they are anyway, sometimes even free, as people remove them and want to get rid of them. As an example, I picked up this huge window recently for a future project coming soon to the channel, and I got this set of French doors for £100. To buy these new would have probably cost closer to £1,000. They're also cheap where time is concerned too, as it would probably take me half a day to build a wooden shed door, so when you consider the cost of the timber plus the cost of your time, it's unlikely that you'd be able to beat the second-hand uPVC door option for value. Thirdly, and this is subjective, but I don't mind how they look. I'm not a fan of plastic in general, especially not single-use plastics of course, but uPVC windows and doors don't offend me in any way. In fact, when it comes to things like doors and windows, having had to deal with my fair share of badly maintained rotten wooden ones over the years, as well as condensation and mould on the inside, which is just horrible, I just don't think you can beat them. For me, it's a similar principle to things like kitchen worktops too, bearing in mind I did a lot of jobs restoring badly maintained wooden worktops a few years back. While a laminate worktop may not look as nice as solid wood when a solid wood worktop is new, if that wood is not properly maintained and it gets water stained, blackened and worn, I'd prefer the look of laminate over that any day. Another really good question was, why didn't I put a header above the windows and doors? A few others also asked why no jack studs around the doors and why no double top plate. So I have a few thoughts here. Firstly, as mentioned in the original video, the planning permitted development height restriction of 2.5 meters meant that I didn't think we were able to put a header above the French doors anyway, or even a double top plate for that matter, but turns out I was wrong about that. I'll explain what I mean by that in a bit. But yeah, the doors we fitted were 2.1 meters in height, which is a pretty standard height for those. And when you take into account the height of the base and roof structure, that planning height restriction is actually quite prohibitive. In fact, it feels almost like that 2.5 meter figure has been pulled out of the air by someone with very little knowledge about how buildings should be constructed. And I think if it were to be increased a little to around 2.8 to 3 meters, it would allow people to build much better quality sheds and garden rooms, and do things like having a full 150mm air gap for ventilation under floors, and being able to have a warm roof rather than a cold roof without having to apply for planning permission. And I'd be surprised if raising that height restriction would have any major impact on those living in neighbouring properties, but Who knows? Anyway, what I mean when I said I was wrong about that, when I built this shed, I had forgotten that the 2.5 metre height restriction is measured from the highest part of the ground rather than the lowest. And as in my brother's garden, there is a raised ground level towards the back fence, it turns out I actually could have built this shed maybe 150 to 200 millimetres taller and still been within permitted development. Someone else pointed out in the comments section too that it's highly unlikely that anyone is going around with a tape measure to police these things anyway, and while that's probably true, as a person putting stuff on the internet which some people might choose to take advice from, I do make every effort to do things by the book wherever I can. Anyway, back to headers and jack studs. As to whether they're actually needed on a shed, I think it depends on the size of the windows and doors that are being installed, i.e. the bigger the span, the more the need for structural reinforcement, and also the weight that will be placed on top of them. In hindsight, I probably should have installed a header above the largest window, but I think it's unlikely that we'll see any issues with it in future. I also want to add that I'm not a trained carpenter, so feel free to take my words with a pinch of salt. A few people asked about stud and joist spacings and what spacings I used. People have different methods for how to do this. I know a lot of people use 400mm center spacings because it's easily divisible by the length of a standard sheet material, but 2440mm isn't divisible by 400mm, well, not cleanly anyway. Plus, if for example you're building a wall that's going to be cladded with OSB, the spacings are going to need to be different depending on if you want the stud to finish flush with the edge of the OSB or centered to the edge of the OSB. So I just think that method is messy, but a lot of this is just about personal preference. My preferred method has always been to space out my joists or studs equally down to the millimetre depending on the size of the structure I want to build, and then cut the noggins and use them as spacers while assembling the walls. Yes, it involves a little bit of maths, but I just find it easier that way. For floor and roof structures, I try and stick to a maximum spacing of 400mm or as close as possible. I think the space between our joists was 406mm here, which is more like 450mm when measured centre to centre. For wall studs, 400mm spacing is also nice, but if you want to put in less and save a bit of money, spacings of anywhere up to 600mm really shouldn't cause any problems in most instances for your average shed anyway, especially if you're using 3x2 or 4x2. But again, I'm not a trained carpenter, but you really don't need to be to build a shed in my opinion. This video is sponsored by Fiverr, a service designed to connect you with freelancers offering a variety of digital services. I recently hired Josh through Fiverr, who specialises in Instagram account audits and growth strategy. Instagram is a platform that I've never been fond of. To me, learning how to succeed on Instagram felt like learning another language, but a language which I didn't have the time nor inclination to learn. In the past, I put a lot of effort into regularly posting videos and images, but basically saw very little engagement and growth. So for the past year or so, I've just posted very little as it didn't seem worth the effort, and I decided my time would be best spent creating content for the platforms that do work for me, those being YouTube and Facebook. But as a full-time content creator, I'm aware that there's potential to reach a whole new audience with my content on Instagram who I simply didn't know how to reach. I had a video call consultation with Josh, who was able to shed so much light on things like what and when to post in order to get on the right side of the Instagram algorithm, how to make my profile more Instagram friendly, how to use captions to get more engagement, and all sorts of other tips and advice. Fiverr's search function made it quick and easy to discover a range of freelancers like Josh, and with each freelancer's portfolio giving an insight into their previous work and a star rating based on work they have previously completed, I could be confident that my requirements were in safe hands, and I was not disappointed. I actually got way more value out of both the video call session and the documentation provided by Josh than I expected to. Freelancers on Fiverr offer a range of services for things like website development, video editing, social media marketing, AI services, interior design, and loads more. If you are interested in hiring a freelancer to help solve a problem for you, please head to fiverr.co/ragandbone and use the promo code ragandbone to get 10% off your first order. I'll leave a link in the description box below, and I'd like to thank Fiverr for sponsoring this video. Why didn't we install a breathable membrane to the walls? So there's a few things here. First, rightly or wrongly, I had always thought that a breathable membrane is for use in insulated garden room style buildings rather than sheds, but It's clear from the comments section that a lot of people have used membrane without insulating, purely just as a way to prevent moisture and drafts coming into a shed. I'll talk more about my thoughts on that later in the video, but anyway, the main reason we didn't go that route is because even though breathable membrane isn't particularly expensive, the costs for installing it properly were more than my brother was comfortable with spending. And it's his shed, so while I can and did make suggestions to him throughout the project as to how I'd recommend doing things, it wasn't my decision to make. With membrane though, first you need battens between the cladding and membrane to allow airflow to prevent any issues with moisture buildup on the back of the cladding. Secondly, unless you like the look of membrane on the inside of a shed, you're going to want to clad the walls with sheet material. So let's say 10 sheets of something like 9mm ply, that's probably a couple of £100. Membrane maybe around £50. Battens probably about £50. That's £300. It's a good chunk of money. 15% on top of the total build cost, by the way. Obviously, if you then want to use it as a garden room in the winter, you'll want to insulate it too, and that could easily be another £300. And you probably want to have insulated the floor as well, so then maybe £750, £800 all in. And all that would work out to be more than a third of the cost of the entire shed that we built. With the benefit of hindsight though, because of the shrinkage issue we experienced with the tongue and groove cladding, I do wish we'd at least done the battening and membrane. Why didn't we cut some fairings to use on the roof? This is another good question, and yes, I could have just built all 4 walls to exactly the same height and then cut 12 fairing pieces to add to the roof joists to create the fall for rain to run off the roof. Nothing wrong with that idea at all, but personally I don't see how cutting 2 angled wall frames to create that fall is any more time consuming. In fact, I reckon it's probably a bit quicker if anything. Plus, I'd also need an additional 6 3-metre lengths of 3x2, which would need to be cut down diagonally to give me the 12 fairings needed. So, in my opinion, nothing wrong with that idea if that's how you prefer to do it, but it'd be slightly more expensive and I don't think it saves any time either. As with anything in woodworking, there are multiple ways to do things and we all have to make these decisions about what methods we choose to use. Why didn't we use a damp-proof coarse plastic underneath the floor joists? I feel like the most correct place for some kind of moisture barrier to be would be between the ground and the blocks, so that moisture can't rise up from the ground into the blocks and then pass through into the timber. But I see a lot of people suggesting to put it in between the joists and the blocks. And doing that, I'd be concerned about the possibility of moisture from condensation or whatever then being able to sit on the DPC and soak into the timber. So I'm not convinced that that is a good idea. Back when I built my shed in 2020, I used DPC wrapped around the ends of the joists and stapled to the top before installing them, but only time will tell whether that was a good idea or not. There is a special tape available for use between joists and deck boards, but it's very expensive stuff. I saw Andy at Gosforth Handyman using that on his latest decking project. I'm keen to hear your thoughts on this though, as honestly I don't know for sure what the ultimate solution is. On my brother's shed we didn't install any moisture barrier to the floor, but honestly there's so much ventilation space under the floor which will allow everything to dry off that I don't think there'll be any problems. And had I been more confident in knowing what the best solution was, I would have suggested doing it. Rodents. Oh my god, the unbelievable amount of comments I got about rodents living underneath the shed. Strangely, all of those comments on Facebook too. I think I only saw one of those comments on YouTube. I don't know if the people of Facebook have severe musophobia, but anyway, rodent mesh is inexpensive and really easy to add if it's something that you're concerned about. I did it on the shed that I built back in 2020 and I've had no issues whatsoever. So far we've had no issues with rodents on this shed either. But yeah, it's an easy problem to fix in my opinion. Right, that's enough talking. Let's do something productive. So I'll need an offcut of the cladding. This piece should do. Thanks for watching. Be sure to visit fiverr.co/ragandbone to check out the services available and get 10% off your first order with the code RAGANDBONE.